But what was it that Jesus did which enabled him to be pleasing to the Father in those 30 years? He never did a miracle in those 30 years. Now remember, this is not at the end of his life. This is at the beginning of his ministry that the Father said, I am well pleased with you. And I never get tired of emphasizing, he had never preached a sermon, never cast out a demon, never did a miracle, and yet the Father said he was pleased with him, because many of us who don't have these gifts think, well, I can't preach and I can't travel. Well, Jesus never preached or traveled. As far as we know, all 30 years, he lived in one small little village called Nazareth. He traveled less in 30 years than almost everybody here. All of us have traveled more than Jesus traveled in 30 years. So it's got nothing to do with traveling. All of us have met more people in our life than Jesus met in 30 years. The people that Jesus met were almost entirely people from his own village. 3 times a year they used to go to Jerusalem and meet a few people. That was for a few days. But otherwise, it was just in a small village that he lived all his life. And he was pleasing to the Father. So nobody has an excuse saying, I can't do this or I can't do that, I haven't gone here, I haven't gone there. If you look at Jesus' life, let me show you in Luke's Gospel chapter 2, a few things about what made him pleasing to the Father. There's very little written about his life in those first 30 years, but the few things that are written, we can learn something. In Luke chapter 2, he was 12 years old and he went to the temple. We read in Luke 2:42, he became 12 and he went to the feast. And when Joseph and Mary were returning, he stayed behind in Jerusalem. He stayed behind. While all the other boys were, playing around, he stayed behind. It was his choice. But his parents were unaware of it. And the parents found him after 3 days, verse 46. They had traveled quite a bit of time, maybe more than a day they had traveled, and they suddenly looked for him and didn't find him. They were all traveling as a community of a whole lot of people, like going for a conference, a whole group of people. And they assumed, even for 36 hours, they assumed he must be somewhere else with one of the other boys. And it's only after 36 hours they discovered, hey, he's not here. And they walked back the 36 hours and discovered that Jesus was in the temple. This shows us one thing, that it took a long time for them to walk from Nazareth to Jerusalem. Remember that whenever you read in the Bible that Jesus walked from Galilee to Jerusalem, that wasn't a couple of hours, it was 1.5 days at least. Because these folks walked 1.5 days and 1.5 days back. So little things like this show us how Jesus lived. Anyway, when they came to the temple, they found him, verse 46, in the midst of the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed, first of all, at his understanding of Scripture and his answers. So the first thing I learned about Jesus' life, which made him pleasing to the Father, was that he had a tremendous knowledge of Scripture, even though he didn't have a Bible at home. You want to be pleasing to the Father? That's the first thing we read about Jesus in his life. And that is something that every one of us can do, because we have more than Jesus had. We have the Bible in our own language. Whereas if Jesus wanted to read the Bible, he had to go to the local synagogue in Nazareth and ask the rabbi to turn the scroll and read one chapter to him, and he had to put it all in his memory. Maybe ask him, Rabbi, can you please read that again? Or read that verse again, please read that again. And he couldn't read too much because then he'd forget it. And just read a little bit and think about that, and then go home and think about it, and maybe come back the next day and say, Rabbi, can you turn it to the next chapter? And please read a little more. And the rabbi must have been delighted, because I don't know how many boys would have come to him like that.